Hey, folks. Welcome back again to the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. I am back again here today along with Matt, and today we have a special guest with us, Harley Naumann from the state of Missouri, where he is a forage specialist as well as a professor. Welcome, Harley. Glad to have you here on the podcast today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So, Harley, could you give us a little bit of a background on yourself?
Sure. I am the state forage and grazing specialist with the University of Missouri Extension, as well as a professor that teaches in the classroom a little bit. Originally from Texas, I've been working here in Missouri in fescue-based pasture forage systems, livestock systems, since about 2013.
Very good. Lynn Farmeyer, that's a friend of mine and Matt's in the Katahdin world, and I know, Harley, you said you have some Katahdins as well, right?
Right. Yep.
I reached out to Lynn when we got the question that came in on Fescue, and I said, hey, Lynn, this is something that I don't really know who to ask in my local area. Who could we get on to talk about this? Do you have any suggestions? And he said, let me think about it. And he got back to me. He said, here's a phone number. Try this fella. So I think you're a good candidate for the question. So the question we had came in was from a farmer that has Kentucky 31, and he's wondering about renovating his pasture. He's number one, he's wondering if there's a non-chemical way to go about that. He's wondering if he can rip it up, disc it a couple times. Can he try smothering it with, he suggested crimson clover, rye, hairy vetch, maybe a combination. And so today we have Harley on, and he's going to take a dive into that fescue question, and we're going to see what he has to share with us.
Sounds good.
So, Harley, maybe we can look at the question first from the aspect of what our options are to get rid of it. Maybe we can start there.
Well, and specific to that question, I think maybe we start with the idea of the non-chemical control or renovation out of fescue, and I would say that's going to be a huge challenge. If you're trying to do a total renovation where you want to get rid of all of your tall fescue without chemical control, that's a difficult task. And we've worked with producers in the past that have had this interest and probably observed more failures than we have successes in that endeavor. But some of the things, that can be done, and to the question specifically about maybe putting some other things into it, maybe some disking, those are certainly options. I'll kind of tackle that. Conventional tillage might be something that someone could try to do, but that's, again, what's going to happen is with conventional tillage, you're probably going to do something like plow it up in the fall so that you can leave all of that biomass exposed to winter conditions, right? Let it go through hard freeze, let it go through all of winter, and then when the ground is ready to be worked in the spring, as early as someone could get into it, you go in and do some disking, and you let whatever is there, whatever seeds you brought to the surface, germinate and emerge and green up. And you might have to disc that again, right? And so if you're going to disc it again, you're going to disc it pretty shallow, not to bring up more seed that's been in the seed bank. And you may have to let that green up and disc again, right? So this becomes sort of a process of trying to eliminate what's there with the equipment. And honestly, probably never going to get 100% of it doing that. At some point in that process, if you're using conventional tillage as the tool, then you're probably going to want to go ahead and overseed your perennial grass that is the desirable species that you're wanting to establish. So For us in Missouri, that could be something like orchard grass or smooth brome or something like that, or a mixture of some of the more desirable cool season perennial grasses. So that's one way that would be non-chemical. Again, a lot of work, problem, and not 100% at the end of the day. There's other things that one could do that could get you maybe what we would call partial renovation. So this is accepting that you're not going to get rid of 100% of the tall fescue and just going in and trying to dilute it out. And so ways that you might go about that could be you graze it really short, graze it hard, kind of beat it up a little bit if you could in the fall, and then overseed some of the other things that are maybe desirable, other forage species that are desirable. So again, things like for us would be orchard grass, smooth brome, clovers, right? Other forage species to try to get more of a diverse mixture into that tall fescue base. And usually people are pretty accepting of that kind of a system, where you're not forced to graze the Kentucky 31 at 100% of the intake of the animal, right?
So when you say overseed that, are you talking, would they have to no-till that in after they graze it hard in the fall, if they're just wanting to diversify what's there?
It's a great question. So you don't have to no-till it, but no-tilling is certainly a way, but broadcasting can work well. Broadcasting with maybe some form of disturbance like dragging with a harrow or hoofing it in with animals, or whatever method you need to use to get seed soil contact. That's the main thing.
Sure.
So what if a producer, and this was just an idea I had, what if a producer, rather than using sheep to graze that down, well, if a guy wanted to be in the pig business as well, running some pigs on that area in a high density type of situation where they're actually digging it up, that would probably be a good option, where you have the pigs dig it up and then you overseed it behind them. Have you had any experience with that?
I've had no experience with that personally, but I can rationally think through that and say, yeah, that's probably going to put a little bit of the hurt on the fescue, right? But again, that would be more along the lines of an approach that is going to be a partial renovation, right? You're not going to get rid of it doing that, but you're probably going to open up the ground enough that you can get other things established to go with it, right? Yeah, I could see where that'd be a possibility.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought with that. It might give you more loose dirt. Obviously, you're not going to get rid of the fescue. Along those lines, or whatever method you use, is there certain grasses or clovers that would do a better job of kind of pushing out the fescue or thriving amidst the fescue? I know you mentioned like orchard grass. Is there certain types of grass or clover or other species that you would recommend for that?
I think that considering, well, I think that any of these other grasses we've talked about so far, these cool season perennials that also work in our systems here, I think they are not going to be effective at pushing fescue out per se. I think that they certainly can thrive right alongside fescue. There's the conventional wisdom out there suggests that, well, fescue's dominant and it's going to push everything else out. And honestly, that's just not necessarily true. That is the case if we don't manage our grazing very well, because fescue tends to tolerate, poor grazing management much better than the other species do. So if we go in and we're just overgrazing, continuous grazing, we're going to run those more desirable species out, and fescue is going to become the dominant species in the system. But if we manage our grazing well, then yeah, what I see is these other species can thrive right alongside, and you can keep them in your forage system for a really long time without any issues.
Yeah, the pig, using the pigs, that might work in a small scale situation, but
You can do
well,
one section at a time.
hey, that's true. That's true. Yeah, so I think that does that cover what you have to say on the non-chemical approach?
Well, one other thing I was going to mention back to that last question that just came to mind is we do see some folks that are amending or complementing their fescue forage systems with native warm season grasses. That's kind of there's a big push for that uh, out here in our part of the country, and so uh, things like putting switchgrass into a tall fescue pasture, putting big blue stem Indian grass, those kinds of things. Those are species that with the right management, with the right grazing management, I think those are species that can maybe help keep the fescue at bay in those kinds of mixed pastures. So
Yeah, so what would be your suggestion if we wanted to take a chemical approach to getting rid of it?
yeah,
Is it pretty easy to knock back?
uh much easier, right? So the chemical control is what's recommended probably across the board. I know that for certain reasons, though, there may be a lot of folks out there that don't want to use chemicals, right? Back to the question, the original question, but um, yeah, chemical control is probably the most effective. Um, one, you know, the probably the number one chemical used is going to be, some form of glyphosate, and probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 quarts per acre of glyphosate. And honestly, the most of the research would show that probably 2 quarts is going to be your most effective means of knocking that stuff out. Now, there are a lot of studies out there that have looked at one application compared to 2 applications. So, for example, trying to do one application in the spring and then renovate to something else, compared to maybe doing an application one in the fall and then one in the spring. And the big thing you got to be concerned about is if you do one chemical application, what's going to happen is there's probably a lot of fescue seed in the seed bank, right? So you're going to kill what's there, and then you're going to have seeds from the seed bank germinate and emerge, and you're still going to have the Kentucky 31 fescue there, just new plants. And so that's why maybe a second chemical application is beneficial. And so with that first single pass application, you may get some high percentage of control, but then over time, you're going to see that fescue creep back in and start to be a major part of the plant community among whatever else you planted in there. So a couple of chemical applications are what is suggested. But along the lines of the chemical control, one of the things that we recommend is this spray, smother, spray approach to trying to renovate out of Kentucky 31 tall fescue. And I've sort of modified this idea to be a spray, smother, spray, smother, spray. And what that means is you would come in with your chemical application. So you get your first spray done and you spray that out you spray in the fall. And then what someone could do is then they plant a smother crop of some sort. So in the fall, that for us, that's going to be something like cereal rye or wheat or, some cool season small grain. And so that'll be your smother crop. That grows over winter. And then, of course, we know it really It really starts producing biomass in the early spring, late winter, and then we can graze that or hay it or, harvest it any way you want. So that was a smother crop. Basically, it's serving more as a cover crop over winter. But you've got that smother crop over winter and into the spring, and then you're going to have those new plants emerge from the seed bank I was talking about in the spring. And so you would do another spray event, and then you would plant your second smother crop, which would be some summer crop. So any summer annual, warm season annual forage you might like. It could be Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, could be soybean, could be sun hemp, which we're using more and more around here as a warm season legume. Anything that's going to basically crowd out, shade out, outcompete those seedlings that come up for the summer, if there are more that come up. And then you can spray again after you've used that summer forage crop. You can spray again in the fall. So there's multiple spray events here. So not for the folks that don't want to use chemicals, okay? But then in that second fall, that's when you are going in and you're putting in all of your new, whatever your desirable cool season perennial forage would be. And that recipe is highly successful at renovating out of Kentucky 31 fescue to something completely new and different.
Do you prefer to seed it in the fall like that?
We do. We actually have this sort of rule of thumb, if you want to call it that, that says when do you plant cool season perennial grasses in Missouri? And we say in the fall or not at all. And so that doesn't mean you can't put them in the spring. But what the issue with putting them in the spring is they come up, and then all of a sudden, at least in Missouri, all of a sudden, depending on where you're at, can get very hot, very dry, really quickly, and you can just have a really poor stand establishment because of those conditions. And you'll end up with weed encroachment and all kinds of other problems.
Sure.
But in the fall, the conditions just seem to be just right for it to emerge and produce some roots and hang out all winter long, and then they're ready to rock and roll in spring.
Yeah, that's actually the same thing we find here too. Is maybe not so much that we get hot and dry in the spring, just more you get more weed pressure that first year. So we really like to see them in the fall if we can.
Yeah.
I was thinking about what you were saying there. Would that same system be possible to use to not totally eliminate the fescue, but to get some other things in there without the chemicals? So if we just, let's say we have a scenario where the field's just way too much fescue in it, and we'd like to get some other things established, to throw those cool season grasses right into that fescue might put it at a disadvantage. Would it be an option to go and put, like you were saying, no-till rye into that fescue in the fall, and then in the spring maybe no-till a summer annual like sorghum or Sudan grass in, and then come back in the fall when that fescue by that time should be knocked back? Do you think that would be successful at all?
I don't know how much that would set it back. And the reason why I say that is we've got some practices we promote, or at least I promote in my program quite a bit here, of interseeding annuals into perennial fescue pasture just to make them better.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah. And so, and what I've observed over the last several years of doing that practice, we'll put cereal rye or wheat or triticale or something like that into fescue in the fall. And then we get much earlier green up and much earlier grazing. So we get off hay a lot quicker. If we've got that stuff growing up in the late winter, early spring in the fescue pasture, it greens up before the fescue does. And then we'll turn around, we'll graze the fescue in the spring or through the spring, and then we'll be planting summer annuals into the fescue pasture as well. And we don't see a decline in the fescue. So I'm hesitant to say that would be an approach to control, but that is an approach to getting more out of fescue pastures and diluting any of the sort of negative toxic effects of the fescue. So I like that approach a lot. What I would say, though, might be an idea that someone could think about is maybe they do a disking of their fescue pasture, not a deep plowing or anything, but some sort of a light disking that reduces the fescue plant density, and then they come in and plant those annuals. And if they do that over time, they're going to greatly probably, I don't know this for sure, but I would assume they're going to greatly reduce the amount of fescue. To go back to what you said, if there's just way too much than what is desired in the pasture. So that could be an approach.
So do you have anything to say on just working with the fescue?
Yeah, so I don't want to say I like to push back when anyone says they want to completely eliminate their fescue. But I certainly like to ask the questions as to why and really understand what's going on, because there are some benefits to having it around, as I might have mentioned earlier. I mean, we've got tall fescue that is, shows some drought tolerance compared to our other cool season perennial grasses. It's demonstrates some greater tolerance to close grazing, demonstrates greater tolerance to disease and pests. So those might be some advantages to having that grass in your system. Again, not as a monoculture, but having it as a component. It also is a great option for stockpiling in the fall so that we can extend our grazing season further into the winter and feed less hay. Fescue is one of our only cool season perennial grasses that is capable of standing up to our conditions for at least most of the winter time. The other ones just sort of fall apart once we start to get hard freeze and snow and rain and the cold weather and that kind of stuff. So there's some reasons to keep it around. And so if someone says, I want to completely get rid of it, that's one thing. But if I say, look, are you willing to live with it and have it as, some component, there are a lot of ways we can manage around any of the problems that are associated with fescue. So, one of the things that we know is, so the toxicity, the alkaloids that are produced by tall fescue that cause us some problems at times, they're, situated in the bottom 2 inches of the plant whenever the plant is vegetative. Okay, so in the springtime, before it goes reproductive, it's down in the bottom of the plant. And so we can manage around that by just saying, look, don't graze so short, right? Don't graze it shorter than 3 inches. Better yet, maybe keep a 4-inch residue. And if we do that, we keep the animals out of the toxins that the plant is, that the endophyte in the plant has produced.
Could you unpack that, the negative aspect just a little bit for some of our listeners that don't know what the negatives are? Sure.
So I guess I'll just back up and talk about how tall fescue is, Kentucky 31 is infected with an endophyte. So it's got a fungus in it that is, associated with the plant for the life of the plant. And it's situated down in the crown of the plant, and it's producing multiple alkaloids that are ergot-like alkaloids. And one of the main ones that's at least an indicator of toxicity is ergovaline. And so we know that ergovaline is concentrated in the lower portion of the plant, like I said, about the bottom 2 inches or bottom 5 centimeters. That's where it's most concentrated all through the vegetative part of the life of the plant. If the animal comes along and grazes that down short and gets toxic doses of the ergovaline, then you might start to see, going into the warmer months, you'll start to see fescue toxicosis symptoms, and they may include things like the animal not shedding its winter coat. Well, that can compound a problem that we don't necessarily observe, which is physiologically that animal is undergoing higher rates of respiration. And so you put those two things together and you end up with an animal that is basically enduring a pretty good amount of heat stress. And so then what are they going to go do? They're going to go hang out by the water rather than be grazing in the pasture. You're going to see them, up to their necks in ponds trying to stay cool. All kinds of problems like that. You'll see depressed average daily gains on growing classes of animals. You'll see depressed reproductive efficiency. So there's all kinds of things that can happen with fescue toxicosis if they're getting into the toxic parts of the plant. In the wintertime, it can be pretty bad as well. So that ergovaline is also a vasoconstrictor. So what happens is, the animal experiences reduced blood flow to the extremities. So you think about reduced blood flow to the feet, the hooves, the ears, the tail heads. And what'll happen is with that reduced blood flow, you get into some pretty hard freezing conditions, and those extremities start to freeze. And you see things like pretty good wounds on the feet, and then it ends up being fescue foot. The tail heads will freeze and fall off. The ears can freeze and fall off. And so, those kinds of things can happen as well, which, you never like to see. So,
So
that kind of gets into the symptoms of having Kentucky 31 tall fescue.
So it's primarily an issue for middle of summer, warmer part of your summer. But you're saying it can also be a problem in the winter time. Now I hear a lot. One of the benefits of fescue is you can stockpile it for winter grazing. So as I'm thinking about this, I mean, summertime, it's pretty easy. Don't, maybe not graze your fescue pastures over the warmer part of the season, especially make sure you don't graze them down as far. What other advice maybe would you have for summertime? And also, what can we do to prevent those issues in the winter time?
Well, so our data suggests that throughout the course of fall going into winter, the concentration of the toxin in the stockpiled grass declines. And so the longer you defer your grazing out into winter, the better off you are as far as that goes. And so you may get to, it's pretty conceivable that you would reach a point where that grass is no longer going to deliver toxic dose to the animals. Just like with spring grazing, though, you don't graze your stockpiled tall fescue down too short. It's the same story. So, in the fall, the toxin again is concentrated in the lower portion of the plant. So, there are a lot of folks that want to get as much as they can out of their stockpiled grass. Let's get 80-90% utilization, and they'll graze it really short as a result. And if you do that, then you may be causing yourself some problems from a fescue toxicosis standpoint. Something I didn't get to earlier was, that endophyte, once that plant, once the reproductive tiller starts to produce a flower and a seed head, that endophyte then sort of travels or migrates up that flowering stalk, that seed head, and it concentrates the the toxin up in the seed head. And so, it's something to manage against the plant going reproductive. If you can keep the plant from becoming reproductive, then you can prevent the animal from basically being exposed to the toxin up, higher in the canopy. And one of the ways we suggest doing that is to just graze more uniformly to that 3-inch residue. And once they graze off the reproductive tillers, then that plant will stay vegetative for the remainder of the season. So just a couple of management strategies to get around it. Yeah.
Sure.
Could
they clip the pasture mechanically, like with a mower?
They certainly can. Once those plants start to go reproductive, that's something that I know a lot of producers around Missouri will do, is they'll go out and clip those pastures, and basically it just resets everything to vegetative, and you don't have to worry about the endophyte being up in the upper canopy of the plant. Again, you still got to worry about it being in the base of the plant.
So a big concern for sheep producers is not grazing too low. Now you're saying we can't graze too high either.
That's right. That's right. So you don't want to graze those seed heads if you can prevent it. And again, it just becomes sort of a balancing act with grazing management. What we've seen is good grazing management will allow you to manage around this problem 90% of the time.
Sure. There's a lot of growth there, Liam, between the bottom 2 inches and a seed head.
Yeah, there is. Yep. I just thought it was kind of it's just an interesting observation. We're always telling people don't graze lower than, 3-4 inches. Keep it, it's better for your grass, and you keep ahead of your parasite pressure.
Sure.
And now we don't want to graze the tops off either. So that's all good.
Yeah. With any species, though, we don't, once it goes into seed head, they're not going to eat it as well, for one, and your forage quality goes down a lot.
Right. So could we just talk briefly a little bit about why fescue is good for stockpiling? So if I understand right, one, it holds its protein, its nutritional levels the nutrient levels stay a little higher, even though the stuff is dormant and even going brown, kind of. Is that right?
Yeah, so it doesn't really, I don't know. I guess once we get out into January, February, I suppose it goes dormant. But there are days in Missouri that we'll hit some temperatures and have some sunshine in December, maybe even January. And if you really were paying close attention, if you're going out and measuring with millimeters, the plants still can grow. But what you said is right. It maintains its nutritive value really well. So yes, it'll maintain its protein levels to a degree. They do decline, but not very rapidly. Can be pretty low fiber. So just maintains nutritive value well. And the reason why is it does this better than other perennial grasses is tall fescue produces a waxy cuticle around the leaf, which, if you think about that, it repels a lot of the freezing, the ice, the snow, tolerates the cold rain on it throughout those poor conditions, whereas something like orchard grass doesn't produce that waxy cuticle like fescue does, and so it doesn't hold up. And so you'll see the tall fescue stays green much longer than any of the other pasture species we may be working with. And so that's the main reason why we can stockpile that so much better than we can something else.
Do you have any more thoughts on managing a pasture to bring more diversity in just by grazing?
Sure. So just by grazing, I mean, we can you can achieve some diversity just by grazing in these tall fescue pastures. I was just at a farm, um, probably, I guess maybe a month ago, and we're standing there looking at a pasture that at one time was a tall fescue based cool season grass pasture. So when I say that, I want to kind of clarify what I mean. There's almost no pasture in Missouri that I've seen that is just pure tall fescue. It just really don't exist. They're really a mixture of tall fescue, orchard grass. You'll see some timothy, maybe some brome, and then you'll see legumes in there, and then of course some other forbs, weeds, whatever you want to call them. But we were standing there looking at this pasture that was a tall fescue based cool season grass pasture, and it was full of big blue stem and switchgrass with it, and a whole bunch of native perennial legumes, some desmodiums and other things. And the guy was telling us he didn't plant any of those native warm season species that were in there. He said he basically got that by accident. He was certainly happy to have it, but he got it by complete accident. And it was all about his grazing and timing of grazing. So he would come in and he would graze it pretty well, graze it pretty hard in the spring. And then he would remove cattle, and it would have all summer to basically become what it became. So if you reduce the amount of tall fescue, or you reduce the competition from the tall fescue by grazing it short in the spring and then giving it all kinds of rest through the summer, that's going to open the canopy for plants that are more adapted to those summer growing conditions, right? And so if there are any of those native species, the warm season species that we have here in the system, they start to find a way, right? If they're in the seed bank, and they were native here they were here for a long time. So there are some folks that would suggest that some of these seeds are in the seed bank for, hundreds of years. I don't know if that's true, but these plants came from somewhere. It was just about him and the way he grazed and the timing of grazing. And then the key there is the amount of rest, right? You got to give it the rest. If you've got animals that are grazing on these pastures all summer long, well, anything that's trying to come up, because the fescue's not really being productive, anything else that's trying to come up is getting grazed, right? And so it never has a chance. But if you give it the rest over the summer, over time, you start to see that plant community shift without doing anything. So that's one way that we see a lot of our producers that are managing in this way. All of them have success stories about how they've got these pastures that have become cool season and warm season grass pastures, and they didn't plant any of it. And that's how it got there. It's just timing of grazing, timing of rest, amount of rest. You can sort of accomplish a similar thing by grazing and then planting those desirable species in, right? And so I've done some of that myself, where I graze short at a particular time of the season, and then I go broadcast some of these native warm season grasses like switchgrass into my cool season grass pastures. And now I have really nice mixed pastures of fescue, orchard grass, and timothy and switchgrass and whatever else I put in there. But you got to be able to, you have to have the ability to give the pasture the rest that it needs to, either for those things to come on their own, or for, if you put something out there, for those things to establish. And if you can't afford the land area to give the appropriate establishment time or rest, then you're probably not going to be successful at accomplishing that.
In the middle of the summer there, probably the last thing that the sheep or cattle want to eat, if it's there even, is a fescue, right? They're going to go after anything else that's trying to grow and just leave that fescue sit, I would imagine.
That's what I've observed with my own flock of sheep as well, what you've just described. So yeah, it can be challenging to manage the grazing on those uniformly. If you've got more desirable plants in there and you're letting them be very selective, you know, my sheep here, they'll go and graze the orchard grass and all the forbs and the legumes and everything like that first, and they'll leave the fescue behind if they can. Um, so you got to kind of take away their ability to choose, I guess, if you can.
Yep.
I've found that narrowing down my paddocks will make them graze everything a lot more uniformly. Like they're going to either graze it or trample it or something, and it makes them take stuff they don't like one way or another sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's usually my approach to getting them to graze uniformly as well. If we just increase the stock density, you know, make the paddocks a little bit smaller, make them compete a little bit for the next bite, you know, then they're going to take a little bit of everything, right? That's at least what I've observed.
That competition factor is actually a pretty big deal. I didn't see it until I really started doing a very much more managed rotational grazing than what I did. Those sheep will eat things I never thought they would eat.
Yeah, like
in a situation where I'm increasing the stocking density.
What are some of the things that you see them eat that you didn't think they would before?
Well, they'll actually eat thistles. I had a small, just for an experiment, I had a small area around the buildings that it was hard to get into with a brush hog. It was too rough to mow with the lawnmower. And I actually have a picture of thistles as tall as I was, and I didn't think those sheep would touch them. They weren't really blooming yet, maybe pushing buds, but they were pretty vegetative, nice and green. And we put like 120 head in there for like 12 hours. It was from 6:30 in the morning before I went to work. I took them home out after supper at about 6:30. And I was totally blown away. They stripped all the leaves. All they had was some of the more woody stalks down, like they took the tops off of them. Just totally cleaned house.
Some of that I've noticed can be learned behavior too, where there might be like thistles, for instance, where out in your pasture they won't touch them until they learn that. And I know at certain times it's more palatable, but till they learn that, hey, we can actually eat this, and then they'll go after it. I've heard of people going out, like if they have thistles or something, going out and putting molasses or something on them to get the sheep started eating those, and then like it can be a learned behavior where they figure out, hey, we can eat these things and they're not that bad.
Yeah. Yep. I've had that same experience when I've tried to put some of the brassicas out into the perennial fescue pastures. You know, when I'm interseeding some different things to try to increase the grazing days, put turnip and radish and that kind of stuff out there, and I watched them. There was plenty of forage out there for them to eat, and they just wouldn't touch it for a while. But then once they started, they took to it really well. But they were naive to it, and it took them a little bit to figure it out. So,
yeah,
I had a couple questions here yet. You kept talking about switchgrass. I'm not extremely familiar with that. I'm assuming that's more of a warm season summer grass. I don't know. I was just a little curious on that. And how do your sheep do on that? Do they like it?
yeah. So switchgrass is it's a native perennial warm season grass, high biomass producer. It can be, depending on what kind of switchgrass you had, some crazy numbers out there, 6 to 12 tons to the acre of forage. But that more realistically, probably in the 4 to 5 tons to the acre in a grazing system. And yes, I like having it in there for the sheep grazing. They do well on it. The watch out with it is that it is really nice and productive earlier in the summer, and once it goes reproductive, the nutritive value on it just it tanks. It goes bad. So that usually if I'm using that, it's part of a mixed system. So I've got I'm going for enough diversity that it's okay that they'll graze that all early summer, and they'll graze other things later, like the ragweed and other stuff that comes in. So
yeah, no, that's just not something I was real familiar with. And I thought we should talk about a little bit. There is a lot of other fescues out there, and we use a lot of fescues here in PA that are, I don't know, new and improved varieties, lower toxicity levels, things like that. I thought we should maybe mention that a little bit. And also, are you using any of those out in Missouri there?
well, let me get some clarification from you. So when you talk about new and improved varieties, are you talking about the novel endophyte infected fescues? So they've got, what they've done is they've basically taken the toxic endophyte out of Kentucky 31, and essentially that makes an endophyte free seed, and then they can re-inoculate the seed with the novel endophyte. So a different endophyte that still produces some of the toxin, but very, very low levels. So nothing that, at least as far as I understand, nothing that would ever cause the fescue toxicosis. And so those are some of those new and improved varieties that are out there that, to answer your question, we do have some folks using those in Missouri, but the vast majority of the state is got pastures planted in Kentucky 31 and just keeps them that way. And one of the main drivers probably that would be a negative for renovating from Kentucky 31 fescue to one of these novel endophyte fescues is just cost, right? It's really expensive. It's, last I heard, and I don't work in that area, but last I heard it's somewhere north of $200 per acre to renovate into those novels. Now, that may or may not be what you're referring to on your end. I'm not sure.
I believe so. Like I say, I know there's actually, I have the seed catalog in front of me, and they have like 5 or 6 different kinds in there, and I would say they would all be those I don't know, new and improved varieties, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
Would you see, like, I don't know if you have any experience with it, like, is there any downside other than the cost of getting switched over to those? Is there any downside? I would assume probably they're not quite as hardy, and so forth. Do you have any experience with that? Is there any downside to some of these other varieties?
I'm not familiar with any downside. They're much lower on the scale as far as any potential toxicity goes. So they're considered a lot safer to use. You don't have the depressed animal performance from those. I've not seen the data that say that or that suggest that those are equally tolerant of all of the environmental pressures, all of the stressors that Kentucky 31 is tolerant of. But I know that that's kind of the sales pitch behind them, is that they're not toxic, and they're tolerant of all of these other environmental factors. And so I don't know if that's exactly right or not. So I can't speak on that.
Sure. No, that's what I was after. So thank you.
Yep.
All right. So if somebody wanted to find you, reach out to you with any questions, do you have any contact info you wanted to share?
Sure. Best way to reach out is probably by email. And that would be my last name, Naumann, followed by the letters HD at Missouri.edu. So Naumann HD at Missouri.edu. Feel free to send me a note, ask any questions you got. I'm happy to try to answer them.
Well, thanks again, Harley, for coming on, and appreciate you taking the time to take a look at this question, something that we're not as familiar with here in the eastern end of the country.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation.
I really appreciated the conversation.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening, folks, to the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast, where we look at production-oriented topics that can help your farm be more profitable. Just a reminder that we do take listener questions. If you have a sheep or goat-related question you'd like to submit, you can do that by calling 717-310-3641 and selecting the option for the Sheep and Goat Podcast, or you can send me an email at leon@lostcreekwholesale.net. I would also like to remind you that this call is sponsored by Lost Creek Wholesale, your universal feeder distributor. If you'd like to learn more about universal feeders, feel free to visit our website, www.lostcreekwholesalellc.com. Thanks again, and we'll catch up with you next time.